Okay, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here at the GTC Europe. It's really nice to see that this is now also growing here. And maybe to connect a bit to what you said, say, on NVIDIA strategy. I mean, one of the things which I really appreciate about NVIDIA is that it has a very large group of experts which have a very deep insight into applications. And that's really a distinctive feature which really makes you different from quite a number of other companies who can really connect then to the different, say, scientific research areas. And that's also, say, an approach where I will, say, also refer to in this talk, now more also from the perspective of a supercomputing center, of how do applications actually have the impact in the way of how we involve then our infrastructure towards the future. And we have already, a couple of years ago, decided that neuroscience research is actually really an ideal area because it comes with requirements which really forces us to go beyond, say, what I would call, say, the more classical HPC, which of course continues to exist. I mean, myself, I'm a lattice QCD physicist by education, so I, of course, still would like to use supercomputers for these kind of simulations. But from say, the computer architect in myself considers this more as becoming more boring if I compare it to what is needed in order to satisfy the requirements which comes from this community. Now, I will say first give you, say, a little bit of a flavor of what kind of applications do we have actually in this field, and also try to explain to you that this is really a very broad field, so you cannot really reduce it to a small number of applications. It's really very broad. Touch a bit on, say, the application requirements, and then come to, say, a second part, which is more about, say, computer architectures, to explain where do we stand today, what kind of activities have we done in this area, and how is it actually going to impact towards the future. Now, if we look into, say, brain research, and I have to make, say, the disclaimer, I already said that I'm, say, by education physicist, I'm not a neuroscientist, and move more than towards computer architectures, but I mean, for me, it's really fascinating to see this area, and I think it's really right to say that this is an area where it's a grand challenge, because if you really realize how much is actually known about the way of how our brain works, it's still very little. It's still, we only start to understand of how information is stored in our brain, how information is communicated within our brain. But still, that is the result of, say, a couple of 100 years of research. I mean, for instance, say the pioneer for brain autonomy, Thomas Willis, I mean, that is in the 17th century. A lot of, say, work which still has, say, very strong impact was then actually done in Madrid by Cajal. So that was 19th, 20th century. And you can see, and I will show you later different pictures, I mean, how that also, say, evolved. So you see that was basically the first time when one really, say, realized that there are, say, nerve fibers in our brain. But you can see, of course, with what was available in the 17th century, I mean, that was not, say, a very high level of detail, but already Cajal, with, say, then more modern microscopes, started to draw much more complex pictures. But still, if you look at today, and particularly also I will get back to it when it's about, say, supercomputing, to really get to very high resolution brain atlases, that is really a supercomputing challenge, which still has to be solved. So that is still work ahead. And that's only one aspect, because with a brain atlas, we basically get a static picture. What we don't see there is the dynamics. And there are, again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but there are neuroscientists which say it's the dynamics which is the real critical thing. And as a physicist, I mean, I can very well buy into that, because we know from nature that this is very often a very critical aspect. Now, a lot of work which we are doing is happening in the context of the Human Brain Project. The Human Brain Project is a very large-scale project, actually one out of two flagship projects which the European Commission started a couple of years ago. In 2013, we started with the ramp-up phase. And it's running in the context of future and emerging technologies. So it's not only about brain research or neuroscience. It was started with the belief that research in that field will help to create new technologies, to really drive technologies towards the future. And that concerns not only, say, the work which we are doing, for instance, in the context of supercomputing within this project, but it, for instance, also concerns research on designing and building neuromorphic devices. So it's also about trying to look in completely other types of computer architectures, non-von Neumann architectures. It's a pretty big project, so we are currently in the first implementation phase with more than 100 participants. And then if you take this into account, the budget is not as large as it often might seem. And the goal is to build an integrated ICT infrastructure to enable a global collaborative effort towards understanding of the human brain and ultimately also to emulate its computational capabilities. So you can see here, I mean, the belief is that we can address this grand challenge only by putting all the scientists together, and it's an IT infrastructure which helps them to collaborate on addressing this challenge. And it's also about being able to simulate it, so to look at the dynamics of the brain. So many of the challenges which we have in our brain are just related also with the complexity. And I just give you, say, some figures which gives you some impression about, say, why it's so extreme. It starts already, I mean, just if you think about the brain as a network, if you take, say, a supercomputer as a reference point, it's not only an extremely big network with 100 billion neurons. I think what is much more challenging is it is, say, a network with an extremely high radix. Because each neuron is, say, on average, depends a bit on which part of the brain you're looking to, connected to 10,000 other neurons. So, I mean, computer science, I mean, we're now happy to have, say, something like switches with a radix of 64, not much beyond that, and here we're talking about 1,000 to 10,000. The second aspect is that it has many organizational levels, and if I just look at, say, the community of the neuroscientists, it's not so clear what is really the relevant level. Is it, say, very important to understand the brain at the molecular level, which would, for instance, translate in molecular dynamics simulations, which is done in this field? Is it more important to really simulate say, the brain as a network at scale? Because we know also from physics that certain dynamics you only see at scale. If the problem is too small, you won't see it. I mean, things like a phase transition is just when you go basically to infinity. So, and that gives basically, I mean, you will never, even with the fastest, say, computers which NVIDIA might provide, I think for the time being, we will never be able to simulate both the human brain at the whole scale as well as running molecular dynamics. So we have to be able to separate the different scales and to also make the decisions on how to couple these. Now, another remarkable feature, and that is also what is driving a lot also of the interest, for instance, in neuromorphic computing, is that, I mean, we know that we have a lot of capabilities which go far beyond, say, a supercomputer, but we do it on a very small power envelope of just 30 watt. So we're basically perfectly fine with, say, the requirements from a embedded world. But, I mean, if you look at, say, the announcement for, say, the first exascale system in the US, I mean, they allow for a power budget even up to 40 megawatt, right? So, I mean, we have here 6 orders of magnitudes of difference. But the hope is that by understanding, say, why is this that much more efficient, we can also make our computers in the future more efficient. Now, coming to GPUs, and just let me take as a starting point an event which we had in March this year, when we organized one out of a whole series of GPU hackathons. So it's an activity which is largely led by Oak Ridge National Lab. We had 10 teams in Jülich, which were, say, working for one full week on applications. And 3 of these 10 teams came out of the neuroscience community. So that really demonstrates that there is a very strong interest in using GPUs for this kind of research. And I will give you, say, some examples so that you also get an idea of that it's really a good investment in using GPUs for the problems they try to solve. So one of the teams which was actually present at this hackathon was the virtual brain team. That's code which is they're developers in Jülich, but it's also a lot of developers in Marseille. What they are trying to do is to try a kind of a compromise in terms of the way of, say, the level of complexity they go. I mean, they try to really have a reasonable large model of the brain in terms of the number of neurons, and then interconnect them at a realistic way. So they use, say, data from which had been obtained in the efforts of creating brain atlases, then to derive a connectivity matrix, which they then use for their simulations. Now, one thing which is also interesting, was interesting for me to observe, is that given that this is a field which is using, say, supercomputing only not that long ago, they started to have they basically started from scratch in developing also their software stacks. And that's why they also come up now with, say, a quite modern approach. So having, for instance, domain-specific languages in this area is not uncommon. I mean, tell that to the material science community, tell it to the lattice QCD community, which, say, have already, say, much more experience in, say, using supercomputers, but they have a completely different approach to develop their software codes. Now, in this hackathon, they actually did work on getting their code to a Pascal GPU and got quite impressive performance numbers. Now, I'm not a friend of looking into in terms of, say, speed up. So they started with the original code. It is 150K steps, which they could perform per second. And then when using a Pascal, they could get it up to 40 million. I think what you have to factor in here is also that they had been working here for 5 days, full day, from the early morning till the late evening, with 2 very qualified experts in order to get their code at a very high performance level. But it also shows that an investment in the training and people, also in this very advanced training, really does pay off. Now, another approach is where people are really trying to build up very generic brain models, and with the goal of really being able to simulate realistic models, realistic in the sense of the size of the networks. And that's where it really becomes this, back to this challenge of having, say, the 100 billion neurons. I mean, just if you translate it into, say, a memory footprint, which you need, and unavoidably, I mean, you need, say, even if you work very hard, you need a few kilobytes per neuron to store all this information, and you need even more memory footprint to store also the information about the connectivity. So it's so that is really one of the challenges, and that's why people start to have different approaches. I mean, one approach is to say, okay, I want to be able to simulate the biggest possible network because I believe it's the network dynamics which is so important to understand what's actually going on in my brain. And so they come up with, say, very simple neural models. So just point neurons, because the simpler the neural model, the smaller the memory footprint, and the larger the network which you can actually fit into a computer which just has a limited memory capacity. Now, a bit more other approaches, and actually, in this case, of course, simple neurons, I mean, you're essentially not doing, say, many computations. So you're mainly doing, say, data transport. It's unavoidable. Another approach is that you are working with more morphologically detailed neural models, and one approach is, for instance, multi-compartment models, where, I mean, even so, it's, of course, it's say, chemical processes which go on, but you can actually develop, and that's what is shown here, this as a kind of a model which looks like an electrical circuit, which mimics, say, the behavior of the different compartments along, say, in the neurons and the connected brain fibers. Now, of course, then you arrive at much more complex models, and so the effort to also solve them becomes much, much heavier, and that's where then also GPUs become very interesting, and actually one of the teams was exactly working on solving these kind of problems. Now, the first two examples, they were more, say, from the dynamics of the brains, but still, as already mentioned, we have this challenge of really creating very high detailed brain atlases. And, say, one approach to that in order to create these kind of atlases is that you cut a brain, as you can see here, you cut it in very thin slices. So here you see one of this slice, and here you can see, say, the remainder of this brain. And now you start to basically have, say, then two-dimensional slices of the brain. But at the end of the day, you want to have a three-dimensional model. Now, if you would just put, say, all the images on top of each other, what you would get would not really look like a high-resolution model for the brain. It's actually quite a significant computational effort which is required in order to get to a very high detailed resolution of the brain imaging. I think if you just think about it, it's also easy to understand. I mean, you can already see here, I mean, since the brain is fortunately, say, weak material, if you cut it, even if it's cut in a frozen state, you can already see here there's some rimples. So, I mean, you do deformations, and you have to correct for these deformations. And meanwhile, I mean, processing this data has become extremely advanced. So one way in really getting to these very high resolutions of these images, and in particular also to understand, say, the fiber tracks, they are using, say, a technology which is used polarized light imaging. And so you basically, put, say, these brain slices here, and then you look, you have a light source here, you have this brain slice there, and then you have then different polarization filters, which allows you then to look through this image in different perspectives, if you like, and in this way you can retrieve much higher resolutions. The problem, however, is, and that's where you can again see that it becomes really a kind of a computational challenge, is that you start to have very, say, large amounts of data. So in this case, they basically currently using images where you have a size of 250 gigabytes per image. And then if they go to a full brain, because you have many thousands of these brain slices, we are talking about then, beyond the 300 terabyte then per image. And if you want to process it with a GPU, somehow you have to get this data, say, towards the GPU. Now, another consequence when you have these very high resolution images is you have to somehow understand these images. And in the past, this was done, say, by human beings, but it becomes more and more difficult to actually analyze these pictures by human beings. So that's why people now start to also use deep learning approaches in order to be able to understand what is there in the different parts of the images. So this is just, say, a comparison of, say, an early work on that. So this was basically the result of what was done by hand, and that is using, say, different approaches where then deep learning methods are used to basically identify then here different regions which are indicated with different colors. So having, say, given this overview on, say, the different applications, the question is, what kind of requirements do we actually have, and what does it actually mean for HPC architectures in the future? Now, let me start with, say, the brain simulations. The typical workflow there is you start with constructing the network, and given, say, the very high connectivity of this network, this is actually a phase in the workflow which can take quite a significant amount of time. And so you want then also to have these simulations running for a very long period of time in order to reuse, basically, once you have constructed this network. Then you do the analysis of these, you simulate these networks, and during this simulation, you track then observables. Could, for instance, the rate at which, say, the neurons are spiking, or how membrane potentials are changing. So you pile up a lot of information from observables, which then needs to be analyzed. And so first challenge which is there in this kind of application is that they really, at least some of the research groups, they would like to be able to simulate the biggest possible networks. And this is really something where people start to be memory capacity limited. And what is actually interesting to observe is if you look back in the last 10 years in, say, the supercomputers and how they developed, the memory capacity of the supercomputers basically almost stayed constant. It was, say, the K computer, Fujitsu, which came up with, say, a memory footprint of 1.4 petabyte. And whatever came thereafter, I mean, it increased a little bit, but none of the computers went beyond the 2 petabyte. Even so, we now went from, say, a 10 petaflop system to a 100 petaflop system. So the compute capabilities increased by a factor of 10. The memory capacity hardly increased. And I will come back to this point in the next slide. Now, the second thing is, of course, you also care of how long it takes to do the simulations. And ideally, you would like to simulate a certain biological time in a very small time period. And still, with these kind of simulations, you need several orders of magnitudes more time, more clock time, in actually to carry out the simulations. So again, this typically boils down that you are interested in having, say, a high memory bandwidth in order to speed up the processing. And the third aspect, which I would like to highlight, because that's something where also, again, it goes beyond what we see on today's supercomputers, which are typically operated with a batch queuing system. It's in this area where people are asking for being able to interactively steer their applications. So they want to be able that when the simulation is running, to immediately visualize the outcomes of these simulations. That's not necessarily, say, the biggest challenge, because there are sufficient possibilities, I mean, to stream out the data and to visualize it. The bigger challenge is actually if you actually want to steer it. And that's where we also have continuous discussions with the neuroscientists of how quickly do you actually want to steer. I mean, it's really about, say, having the feedback loop, which then results into the requirement of being able to do everything in a relatively short period of time. So basically being able to get somewhere at the 10 millisecond range where you perceive things as being interactive. If you just have to stream the data and you process it, I mean, then you could tolerate much larger latencies. So then things become simple. It's the feedback loop which makes it then more difficult. And by the way, I mean, just also to stress that, I mean, how important memory capacity is. It's basically the only community I'm aware of which didn't come up with a performance model, but with a memory model. So to understand of how does the memory footprint change as a function of the parameters of the simulations, including the number of nodes which they are using. And that's where they really are optimizing for. And this is actually, say, also one area, and I take this as a kind of a short digression, where I think there is not only for the neuroscientists, but in particular for the neuroscientists, but also for many other application fields, there's actually quite a challenge if you think about future HPC architectures. So if you just look at the more, say, abstract perspective, I mean, what you ideally would like to have is to have a lot of memory capacity. But with the computing devices, in particular the GPUs, becoming faster and faster, you would like also to have a high memory bandwidth. Now, if you look in, say, the available technologies, it becomes basically unaffordable to satisfy both. And I just looked here, for instance, at two technologies. So HBM currently used, say, for instance, also in the NVIDIA Pascal and the Volta GPUs. They come up with a very high bandwidth, but say a rather moderate memory footprint. Depends a bit on the perspective you take. I mean, looking, say, a few years back when you still had only 3 gigabytes on a GPU, I mean, of course, now having 16 gigabytes is fine, but you are far away, say, from, say, 128 gigabytes, which you have, say, on a more standard cluster node. And that's where you still have, say, DDR4 technology, which, however, comes then with significantly a smaller memory bandwidth. And you can see this this significant difference if you look at the ratio of the memory capacity over the memory bandwidth. So you can think about it. I mean, this has a dimension of time. You can think about it. This is basically the time you ideally need to write your full memory or to read your full memory. And you can really, if you analyze the technologies in a bit more detail, it's really, say, at the end, the technology which defines basically the range at which you are with this delta T. So if you are in a typical DDR4 cluster configuration with, for instance, 2 ranks of memory, then you are at, say, about 1 second. And if you populate more channels on your CPU, you increase both the capacity and the bandwidth, so basically this ratio stays constant. So, of course, you can make it a bit smaller by a factor 2, you can make it a factor 2 larger, but that's basically, it's about, say, the order of magnitude. Now, if you look for the high bandwidth memory technologies, whether you look at HBM or hybrid memory cube, you're more at something like 24 milliseconds. And you could continue the same game also if you go to non-volatile memories. Then you're basically somewhere in the 102,000 seconds. So you have a very clear distinction of these different technologies. Now, if you want to satisfy both, I think just because of the cost, I mean, you will never have, say, a petabyte of HBM2, at least not in the near future. Then I think the only way to realize, say, high capacity, as long as you need it, is to go to a hierarchical memory organization. And that also means that you have to think about how can I exploit it as, from the application side. And for the neuroscience applications, they only start to really address this. Now, going then from the simulations to, say, the brain atlases, so the kind of applications which I have shown to you is, for instance, about brain image registration, but also important component analysis to reduce the noise of the PLI images. They eventually can map that into computational kernels which map quite well onto GPUs because it has a very high level of parallelism. At the end, it has a lot to do with, say, the mutual information exchange. The main challenge which I see here is to actually be able to move the data fast enough then onto the devices. And this one example of the important component analysis they did actually in comparison what they could get on a node with a K80 and on a power node with NVLink. And they could really see that they benefit from, say, the fast hosted device link because the time the computation needs is becoming, say, often similar order than the time it needs for the data transport. Now, finally, for, say, the more deep learning area, I think there's not too much to say about. I mean, this is clearly dominated by blast level 3 routines, and that's where, say, GPUs are very interesting. But I think also here, one thing to really look at it, and that's what we are currently doing, is also here memory capacity considerations play a role. Because at the end, it's the memory capacity which limits, say, the size of the network which you can use for training. And there might be, say, a trade-off in terms of what is the algorithmic performance loss due to going to smaller networks, and what is the gain in terms of, say, the computational performance by being able to fit everything into a high bandwidth memory and therefore speed up the computations. Now, one thing which we noticed more also in terms of the interaction of a supercomputing center with, say, a science domain is that it takes a very long time to really understand what are the requirements coming from this community. And since they are pushing, say, the boundaries of what is possible with today's HPC infrastructure, this is, of course, a very critical issue to understand where they are really heading for. And sometimes we've got surprised that suddenly their storage requirements scaled even for our large storage systems into a range where it's not so easy to satisfy them. And that's why we are now also working in a much more systematic way and trying to capture what is actually the requirements which you have in this field. Now, what is very clear is that if we look at all the different applications which I've presented to you, actually, the more challenging one among them, they are really have the challenge of dealing with large amounts of data. So that's why when one does this analysis of the workflows, one really has to focus on the data and how to move the data. Of course, what also factors in is what is the time which you need to process the data, because that tells us of how much time do we have, how fast should we be able to transport the data so that you're not constantly waiting for the data. But in the end, it's really largely about trying to understand how much data has to be stored, where, when, and at which quality. And that's why we started to also introduce models and now work with the community in trying to convince them to go through the effort, and the effort might be quite significant, to really express their applications in terms of, say, abstract models. And one such model, which we've been now exercised for quite a number of these applications and work quite well, I call it, say, an annotated use case model diagram. It's basically expressing, say, the architecture on which the workflow is executed by a number of simple components. So you start with having somewhere a data ingest that could, for instance, be a brain image scanner. This data is, of course, being processed, so you have something which we call then a processing station that could be just the compression of the data. And then, of course, the data has to also be stored, so we have somewhere data repositories. And these different components are interconnected by, say, data transport. Now, this is actually an abstract model of something which is more complex, which you're currently also building up in Jülich, where we have one institute, which is here at the site A, which is a Neuroscience institute, which has acquired now a number of high-performance brain scanners. They are producing, when they are running at full speed, 16 terabytes per day. And site B, in this particular case, would be the Jülich Supercomputing Centre, which eventually is receiving all the data because that's where the data is processed. So you have some initial processing of the data, which is still done at the Neuroscience site. Then the data is moved, and we have some intermediate buffering to allow for links to go down or to be maintained. It's moved then here towards the Supercomputing Centre, where it goes into an archive, and then you have to perform, say, analytics on this data. Now, this is a very much simplified picture. In reality, this is going to be much more complex because the archive which they need is actually going to be a couple of petabytes, and then they want to use to run very demanding jobs on it. So that's why we also try to use these kind of approaches to make them realize, okay, there's different qualities of storage, and it becomes much easier if you could provide you a lot of capacity with not that high performance, and think about how could you organize your workflows that you only have a part of your data really being active. So it's then really, I mean, if you think about the data transport, is trying to understand what is, say, the maximum, the average bandwidth which is needed. What is also the kind of interfaces which are required? Because we are not only talking about data transport within a supercomputing center, it's already here between different sites, and I will later also touch on where we want to go. And that is to connect really different supercomputing centers, different data sources. So where we're talking about the federated data infrastructure, and then the question of interfaces becomes a very complex challenge. For the data repositories, well, also here, I mean, when we talk about, say, petabytes of storage, it's also something which we cannot, say, just afford and just add a few petabytes to our storage. So that's something which you need need to know well in advance. And also for the data processing stations, understand what are the hardware requirements there, what is the kind of hardware which allows to do an efficient processing, and how much time is needed for doing this processing. So that brings me then to the final chapter on the HPC infrastructure. So where do we stand in the Human Brain Project as of today? We started a few years ago to bring together, say, a number of supercomputing centers. So it's Jülich in Germany, it's Barcelona in still Spain. We have the systems in Bologna at Cinica, and we have in Switzerland currently the biggest system, GPU accelerated system also in Europe, it's Pitzstein. Additionally, we have, say, cloud storage, and we have some high-fidelity visualization systems. And what we only last year added to it is a few special systems, and we'll explain one of these systems a bit more because that's also where NVIDIA had been involved in. It's a system which we call JURON. So it's all our systems somehow start with U in the name, and RON obviously coming from Neuron. It's a system based on IBM Minsky nodes with say, strongly rely on the GPU acceleration to get to a performance, in this case, of 350 teraflops. Now, one thing which I think is very interesting also for us, both driving the technology development in the way of how we provide services, but also to allow the scientists to develop their applications, is that it integrates different memory technologies. And so we have in the GPUs the high bandwidth memory, we have attached to the power processor the DDR memory, and we have also integrated on each of the nodes an NVMe device. So here you can see, say, the difference in terms of the capacity and the bandwidth, and you can see they clearly differ by even sometimes different orders of magnitude. So looking a bit more detail into the node architecture, probably many of you are familiar with the architecture of the Minsky nodes. You have a dual socket Power 8, which to each of the sockets there's system memory attached to with, say, a relatively high bandwidth of 115 gigabytes per second. And then for each of the CPU sockets, they are connected to 2 GPUs, and all these 3 processing devices, they are interconnected with the NVLink technology, which gives you, say, an extremely high bandwidth compared to what is available for, say, using a PCI Express-based solution. And then attached here to the GPU, you have then the high bandwidth memory, which is not shown in this picture, but it is attached then to one of the CPU sockets connected via PCI Express. You have then a non-volatile memory attached to that. So we have, say, different types of compute devices. We have a heterogeneous architecture, and actually, really, if you look at it, it's quite pushing the balance in an extreme. It's almost all of the compute performance comes from the GPUs. And a very interesting feature is that you have these very high interconnect using NVLink between the both of the 2 GPUs, as well as also the connection then towards the Power 8 processor. Now, while we have a quite good understanding of how actually to use DDR memory, how to use, say, HBM memory, even so also there things are in the flow with trying, say, to integrate them into one address space. There's actually much more work still need to be done in how to actually integrate non-volatile memory. So far, we typically think about devices using non-volatile memory as I/O devices, and that's how we use them. But now, non-volatile memory technologies actually allows them to really think about how to use them as memory. And there was a nice development within, say, a project which was called the Pre-Commercial Procurement, which was funded through the Human Brain Project, where IBM was developing what they call distributed shared storage, which allows within the system, which I presented in the previous slides, allows to address this non-volatile memory within a global address space. So you really start to be able to treat this non-volatile memory as addressable memory. And the interface which is being used is, you just look at it as a remote network device. And so you basically, you just use then get put operations to access basically any memory anywhere in the network. Right? And that works very efficient. Of course, it requires changes in the applications. Instead of having, say, an F-write, you have then a put operation, and you have to define at which address are you actually putting this data. So the advantage is now you start to have a globally byte-addressable access to the dense memory. You can have a very high IOPS rate, so you're not, you don't have the challenge of going through many I/O layers, because you basically exploit what has been done in the network. So you bypass the full kernel. You communicate almost directly with the hardware. You can do asynchronous data management, and there's this very tight integration into the network. So it's quite a number of interesting features. Still, there's quite a lot of work which needs to be done. These interfaces are pretty low level, how to actually make them usable for the applications. I would also like to highlight, in order to connect to, say, my first slide, visualization power was also a lot of work done in the context of this project. And one of the benchmarks which we put out there was a pretty complex software stack developed at the EPFL in Switzerland for rendering neuronal simulations. And you can see here, if you compare it with the pictures which I showed you in the first slide, that nowadays with modern visualization, you can have very, very high resolution pictures. I think this system is also very interesting in terms of thinking of how to evolve with visualizations in HPC context. because it's a system which has GPUs in each node. So you obviously can do in situ visualization. But given its capabilities of moving data into non-volatile memory devices, you can also think about in-transit visualization. So you have a few nodes which are dedicated to doing the simulations. They stream the data into the non-volatile memory, and then you have maybe one server which is dedicated to do the visualization, which collects the data and then visualizes it. Personally, I think that is actually because it allows to decouple, say, the simulation and the visualization. I have a bit more preference for going, say, this direction. Even so, I know that in situ visualization is currently much more, say, in the focus of current research activities. Now, where do we want to go in the future? Well, we clearly need to continue to have very scalable compute services. So high-end compute resources, I think they are most likely will have to be accelerated in order to get to the right performance levels. Also, that will not be, say, suitable for all the applications which we find in this area. And we also want to provide a significant increase in terms of the memory footprint, but this we can only achieve by using dense memory technologies, basically translates into non-volatile memory technologies. They have basically both features. But in this case, it's really the density of the memory which is interesting. Now, another aspect where we are working on this is really more on the software stacks. We really believe that we have to federate, say, the different data repositories at the European level, so that researchers, we know that we have, for instance, researchers in Italy which store the data. Then in Bologna, we have a similar research going on in Jülich, and the people want to combine the data sets, and that is only possible when you have a federation. And what we also see is, and that's probably not that unique, but it's probably the community where we can, say, move fastest in getting it into a place, that there is a more need of having interactive computing services which are tightly integrated into the HPC systems. So which allows them to do an interactive steering of the applications. So where the data is streamed out on these interactive nodes, and then you process the data and steer the applications. But it would also allow to do, say, research using Jupyter notebooks, and then at certain points you have calculation where you need, say, different kinds of data. Then you reach out to the federated data infrastructure. Or you may also have a need for having much more, say, compute capabilities, and then you spawn, say, an application then on the scalable compute services, which are part of the same infrastructure. So that's really where we would like to go, but that is still quite future-looking. We hope to be there in maybe 1 to 2 years. So to summarize and conclude, I hope that I could convince you that, say, brain research is really an exciting area within, say, the computational sciences. There are still quite a number of very fundamental questions which are not yet solved. And in order to address them, there's a very broad range of applications. There's not the one killer applications. And many of them do benefit from GPU acceleration. That's at least what we see as of today. And for us, from a computing center's perspective, I mean, we really see computational neuroscience as a field which helps us then also to drive our infrastructure into new directions, because they do have the need for exascale computing capability, they have extreme data challenges, and they also have use cases for interactive supercomputing. So these are all, say, aspects and features which you don't have today, and it's very important to work with the science community in order to put them in place, in order to do them in the right way. Thank you very much.